Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to you all to this international conference entitled The Credibility of Scientific Expertise and Decision-Making.
International Anses Symposium, which is titled Credibility of Scientific Expertise and Decision-Making.
Everyone here will recognize that this time, the age of environmental crisis, the health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the question of scientific expertise is a burning question of current affairs, and it seems to be here for a long time. Where do experts draw their authority? How can they continue their mission in this age of fake news and conspiracy theories? How can we ensure that they are independent? Why are they condemned by so many people? And how can we deal with this mistrust? How does policy use the work of experts, and up to what point does society and do our systems depend on their opinions and recommendations? These are the questions that we are going to be asking and trying to answer over the next 2 days. And these questions will also continue during the workshops on the 26th of January and the 2nd, 8th and 9th of February with the top global researchers on this question, many of them coming from the field of social sciences. And to open this great event with more than 1,500 people signing up for this event over the world, we have Bruno Maquart. Welcome. You are the president of Universcience. It is a public institution that covers the Palais de la Découverte and the Cité des Sciences et l'Industrie, the City of Science and Industry in France, where we are currently today. A complex dedicated to scientific and technical culture and that welcomes 3 million visitors every day. Mr. Maquart, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, Member of Parliament, Roger Genet. Bruno, I am delighted to welcome you here, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this new studio in the Cité des Sciences and Industry. We are adapted to the current situation. It is going to allow us to run our events and to continue our mission. So, what is the mission of this institution? Just like the Palais, we welcome 50 million people every year. We are an intermediary between scientists and the public. We are the link in the chain, and we are bidirectional. In addition, we have the OPEX with Cédric Villani. We have scientific culture. We have a number of actors whose precious contributions are going to be shared with us. But we are not here during ordinary times. We have learned over the years to diversify our modes of intervention with different types of audiences, including the general public. And these modes of intervention all call on scientists at one point or another. We are not a university, we are not a research center. It is therefore essential for us to go to the source to get our information, to go for science and to seek out scientific expertise. We have a relationship of trust with the key institutions and experts, and science is a subtle, it has to be handled with subtlety. We must explain not only the results of science, but also how it works. We must explain to people how it works. And so this is why I am delighted to be here with the Anses, and we are soon going to be developing joint actions with them in the future. So I can say that even remotely, you are at home with us, and we are at home with you. We are a public institution. We are here for researchers, for innovators, for entrepreneurs. Everybody is welcome. And of course, the matters that we are addressing today are extremely important to us. The public is asking and seeking not only to understand, but to take action and to interact with us. Interaction, remote interaction, is a key concern for us at the moment. We have natural history museums and the arts and crafts, and this is why we have detailed explanations about what we're doing, and human mediation is one of our specialties. And this is why we are talking to you live today. Public participation with Fab Labs is one of the things that we do, and another is Fab Labs in schools to initiate young people into the digital world. So everybody seeks understanding, and we are trying to arm our citizens in order to be better able to deal with information. For this, we need to have curious minds and critical thinkers. We are also involved in capacity building with our fellow citizens, and it is only thanks to philosophy that we can learn about dialectics and to get involved in this debate. So now let me hand over to Mr. Genet. Welcome, Mr. Genet. I can see that you have already started discussing your joint projects for the future. You are the director of the Anses, the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety, and you are organizing this event today. Thank you very much. I am going to keep my mask on out of respect for my fellow panelists. We are delighted to be here. Thank you, Cédric, Mr. President of Universcience, Bruno, colleagues, friends. I am really delighted to be here and to welcome you to the Cité des Sciences et Industries with Bruno Maquart, this a wonderful center with his missions are so close to ours. We have also Cédric Villani, President of the Parliamentary Office for Evaluation of Scientific and Technological Choices. I wish you all my very best wishes for this new year. We hope that we will be going back to social and professional relationships that will be happening in a calmer environment. Now, this conference that we are opening today is will happen across several days and running into February as a result of the health crisis. And what we would like to do is to think collectively together about the new challenges that health governance is facing at the moment. We'll be talking about the role of scientists and experts, the role of decision makers, of elected officials, and of the fourth pillar, the media, the press, associations, NGOs, charities, citizens, in between participation and opposition in some cases. We want this opportunity of the 10th anniversary of the creation of the founding of Anses, the 10th of July, the 9th of July last year. We want to open onto a new dimension as a result of this crisis that we have been experiencing over this last year in France with citizens' conferences on the climate and the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been a series of crises, and the crisis of public trust has been accentuated. The public has been forced, and we have been forced into the spotlight, as it were, in terms of decision-making and the use of expertise. Parliamentarians have seized these questions in recent months, and I really want to thank the president of OPEX for having sponsored this event. The partnership with Universcience that we are opening with them and who is joining us in this event. We hope that we will have future projects together. The question of uncertainty, health risks, the risks for health, the risks for environment with electromagnetic waves, and the question of crossing the species barrier from new infections. All of this raises societal questions and requires thinking about how information is passed on to the public in order for our democracies to function effectively. Environmental occupational health involves the impact on the environment for humans and for animals, but also the impact of humans on the quality of the environment in this One Health approach. All of this is the subject of growing concern by the general public, which increasingly wants to be involved in the choices and in the decision-making, especially during times of crisis, as we have seen with Lubrizol in France and also with the global pandemic of COVID-19. There are for around 20 years now, a lot of agencies all over Europe are here to shed light on expertise, to be independent, to highlight multidisciplinary expertise on the conceptual progress, on the methodology of risk assessment, and the weighting of the evidence in all of these different disciplines. But we've also seen the rise in conflicts of interest and the issues of scientific integrity. And clearly this is not enough to answer the questions and controversies in the public arena. This is a reflection of the tensions and the mistrust when we are faced with situations of extreme uncertainty. And sometimes the unknowns are greater than what we do know. So we are going to look at these questions in the light of human and social sciences with all those who have carried out a great deal of work on the issue, both internationally and nationally, especially with the work done by France Stratégie here in France. And we'll be looking at the conditions that underpin the credibility of scientific expertise. So once again, a very warm thanks to the scientific committee who have organized this session and these two plenary sessions and the 10 workshops. We will be contrasting our points of view and our ideas on these questions and looking at the different contexts and cultural environments in which they occur. And so this question of the credibility of expertise really is the raison d'être of Anses. Are we able to produce expertise and risk assessment in a way that is open and transparent, that covers the world of work and the environment and all aspects of life? Anses is founded on very demanding methodologies and to listen very carefully to all of our stakeholders, charities, professionals, the public, in order to have an open discussion both before, during and after the experts do what they do. We are also one of the promoters and founders of the Charter of Expertise and Society and the promoters of the involvement of civil society in this process. It is in order to better succeed in our missions and to contribute to training, to information and the dissemination of scientific expertise and, of course, to public debate that we decided to have and hold this conference. So what are the conditions in order to re-establish the credibility of scientific expertise? What are the obstacles that we will have to overcome in order to transcend this crisis of confidence and the mistrust? So we will be again questioning health governments and environmental risks and the role of society and experts and expert knowledge. The conclusions of this conference will be used to nourish the work of our scientific committee and we hope more broadly all of your thinking on the subject. So once again, thank you for your contributions. I would like to thank everybody who has contributed to making this event a reality, not only our scientific committee, but also our head of communications, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Genet. Let me now turn to Cédric Villani. Thank you very much for being here with us. You have already been introduced by Mr. Genet. You are a mathematician. You are a winner of the Fields Medal. You are a member of Parliament for Essonne, and also president of OPEX, which is a parliamentary department whose role is to advise Parliament on scientific and technological choices.
C'est un grand plaisir, c'est un honneur pour
You have
moi
the floor.
d'être invité
Thank you very much.
en
I'm
ouverture de
delighted
ce
to
colloque.
be here to
Je salue Roger Genet, je salue
for the opening
Maquart.
session
J'ai eu
of this
l'occasion d'interagir
conference.
avec eux en
I
diverses
have,
qualités.
on many
J'ai été
occasions,
d'ailleurs il y a quelques années
been
membre
in
du conseil
discussions
scientifique
with
d'Universcience.
many of
Et je dirais que
the people
la
on the
distribution de
panel
cette
in
ouverture avec M. Maquart, M.
different
Genet,
capacities.
moi-même, représente bien plusieurs facettes
We,
de la diffusion des
I think,
sciences.
are aware
Sciences
that
telles qu'elles doivent être utilisées pour irriguer la connaissance du
we
public, et
are
les
here
sciences telles
to
qu'elles doivent être utilisées
irrigate
aussi pour irriguer
the
les
knowledge
décisions des
of the
politiques.
public and also
Et
decisions
aujourd'hui, nous avons
taken on their
plus que
behalf.
jamais des sciences pour éclairer la décision politique.
So
On le
this
voit
question
bien
of
sûr de
how
façon
we
extrêmement
can
forte
shed light on
dans la
public
pandémie,
policy
les
and
complications qui sont
decision
liées à la crise
making
du coronavirus, avec les
is
choix extrêmement difficiles,
extremely
cornéliens parfois,
important. Very
que doit
difficult
faire
decisions have had to be taken
l'exécutif dans la mise en
with
œuvre.
the ongoing
Mais on le voit aussi
pandemic.
dans tous les grands enjeux de société auxquels nous
But
devons faire face.
this has also been the
Les
case with
questions de
the key
réchauffement
societal
climatique, les questions
issues,
d'effondrement de la
such
biodiversité,
as
les questions de déchets, les
global
questions
warming,
liées aux
waste
pesticides, liées à la
management,
santé
the
environnementale,
use of
mais aussi
pesticides,
les questions liées aux
occupational environmental
investissements
health, but
en
also
matière
questions relating to
d'informatique, d'innovation, de
investment
technologie
in
quantique,
IT,
de tout ce que vous voulez.
quantum
Il y a
technology,
aujourd'hui tant de
and
difficiles et
many
d'importantes
other
décisions
issues.
politiques dans lesquelles le regard scientifique est capital.
The interpreter apologizes. The
Cela
quality
ne
of
va
the
pas
connection
de
is
soi.
rather
Ce n'est
problematic.
jamais facile le
It
débat
is never
entre
easy
science et
to
politique.
hold this debate
Et on l'a vu
between
de façon
scientists
forte
and
au cours de la
politicians
crise
and
du
policymakers, and
coronavirus,
we have seen
quand
this
le débat public a été
really
souvent
come
obscurci
to the fore
par la multiplicité
with
des
the
voix qui se sont
pandemic.
exprimées
There are
et
really
par
many,
le fait
many
que notre
voices
société n'a pas l'habitude
being
de
expressed
voir
at
la
the present
controverse
time,
scientifique
and the issue of
exprimée de
scientific
façon publique
controversy
et violente,
has
et parfois
been
déformée,
very
ou
public
parfois maniée avec
in a way
mauvaise foi
that
ou
people
avec
are
une
perhaps not
conséquence.
used to,
Bien sûr,
and its
la controverse
consequences are
scientifique
clear
est
for all
quelque
to
chose de
see.
normal, de
Scientific
naturel.
controversy is, of course,
Et je
something
l'ai vu dans
normal
ma carrière de
and
scientifique,
natural.
je l'ai
And in my
vécu.
career as a
Toutes les
scientist,
grandes
I have seen this,
avancées
I
sont
have
venues
experienced
avec de
this,
grandes discussions,
and all of
des
the
débats et des
major
combats
leaps
parfois
forward in
enflammés entre scientifiques,
scientists
et
have
des erreurs
come as a
monumentales
result
commises
of
par les plus
impassioned
grandes
debate
sommités
and
possibles.
sometimes
Cela est compris, cela est admis, il y a
massive
certaines
errors
règles de débat scientifique,
committed
et cela
by
va jusqu'au moment où
a
chacun
very
comprend que
well-known
l'opinion scientifique
scientists
change
at
de
the top
camp
of their field.
et où un nouveau consensus
But
s'établit.
it is only through debate that you can
Cela
establish a new
transposé directement,
consensus.
dépaysé directement dans la
And
sphère
this
publique, a
has
pu aboutir à des
been
situations très
launched
dommageables, et on
into
l'a vu
the
de façon
public
très forte.
sphere in a way
Dans la
that I
crise
think
dans
has
la crise
been
du coronavirus,
rather
mais on le
damaging,
voyait aussi
as we all
dans
know,
certaines
with the
interventions, et en particulier
coronavirus
certains pays sur des
crisis.
débats tels que la lutte
And
contre le dérèglement climatique,
different countries, this has also been the
l'enseignement de la théorie
case
de l'évolution
with
des
the fight
espèces,
against
etc.,
climate change
etc.
and
Donc c'est un dialogue dans lequel
other
la
areas.
controverse doit faire l'objet d'un traitement respectueux et
So I
délicat.
think these controversies need to be subject to debate, but it also has to be done in a respectful and a civil
La
manner.
France, historiquement, a été l'un des pionniers en la
Historically,
matière.
France was
Dans
one of
les
the
années
pioneers in
1660 que
these
l'Académie des sciences a été
areas.
fondée, précisément pour que les scientifiques puissent éclairer en toute indépendance les choix gouvernementaux, les choix du roi.
These academies were founded in France. These were designed to help the king and later on the government take decisions.
Beaucoup aujourd'hui ne sont pas fonctionnels, même s'ils existent sur le papier, elles
Many
n'ont
of
pas d'impact.
these
L'Office parlementaire scientifique,
methods, however, no longer work.
l'une de ces institutions conçues pour
role
éclairer le pouvoir politique et aussi pour éclairer les citoyens,
The Office, the Evaluation of Scientific and Technological
entend bien
Choices
échapper à cette malédiction et
involves
avoir un impact important.
getting away
L'Office
from
parlementaire scientifique,
these,
ou OPEX de son nom complet, Office parlementaire d'évaluation des
tight
choix
spot.
scientifiques et technologiques, est un organe inhabituel puisqu'il est constitué à la fois de députés et
It is
sénateurs,
made up
députés et
of
sénateurs.
both
Il
parliamentarians
représente toutes les
and
couleurs
senators
politiques.
and people of all
On
political
l'a vu
stripes and colours.
de façon intéressante au cours de la crise du coronavirus.
In a very interesting way,
par le président de l'Assemblée nationale
have
d'évaluer la
been
stratégie vaccinale
charged
du gouvernement.
by
le panel
the
de
Speaker of
l'OPEX,
the House
aussi bien au niveau de la composition de
to
l'OPEX que des rapporteurs,
shed light on this debate.
3/4 de parlementaires qui n'étaient pas membres
Three-quarters
de la
of the
majorité
parliament
présidentielle
were not part of the
avaient
presidential minority
venaient a priori
majority.
avec grande indépendance. Et quand l'avis a été rendu, un avis qui d'ailleurs n'était pas
independent. And when our opinion was issued, it was hailed as something that was a strong reflection of this independence.
De scientifiques, et
and we hope to continue doing this with the support
dans l'office des scientifiques
of others.
épaulant l'action des parlementaires pour éclairer les débats politiques avec la meilleure expertise, le meilleur
continue
niveau de débat
to do this to the best of our ability,
bien sûr aussi
using
sur des agences telles que
experts and expertise, as well as agencies such as Anses, to whom we have regularly looked in the past.
La société est plus important, plus vital que jamais.
More than ever, I believe that their contribution is fundamental, and this is why I am so pleased to participate in this conference with such an important topic today. Thank you very much for this contribution.
As we move on to our framing session, we have Sheila Jasanoff, who is here, Ortwin Renn as well, and Daniel Agacinski. They'll be here, the three of them, and thank you so much for your presence. You will make 20-minute speeches, and we will have a Q&A session just afterwards. And before we start listening to Mrs. Jasanoff, I would like to inform our viewers that you can ask questions to our panelists, and all you need to do is send them your question to this email address, which is Anses Symposium 2021 questions@anses.fr. And of course, this email address is quite long and quite complex, but it's very easy. It can be found very easily in the email that you were sent to tell you how to connect to the symposium. Sheila Jasanoff, hello, I hope you hear me well. You are a Alzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. You have authored more than 130 articles and chapters and are the author or editor of more than 15 books. You founded and you direct the Science, Technology and Society program at Harvard. And your work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracy. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give the keynote talk at this extremely important symposium. The topic of trust and expertise couldn't be more significant, both at this time in our history, the history of COVID-19 and the pandemic, but also for the remainder of the 21st century. I would like to contextualize the problem that I'm talking about, both against the background of COVID-19 and then in a more general political theory of the way in which expertise plays out as a political force in modern life. So if I may go ahead, here is a map of the incidence of COVID-19 around the world. And the thing I'd like to point out is that the size of the circles represents the relative severity of the disease in different parts of the world. So already from this map, we see that although it is the same disease, COVID-19, the way that it's landing in different areas of the world is not the same. The incidence varies, and as we will see, the mortality rates also vary. We did a comparative study, with my colleague Steve Hilgardner and some 60 colleagues from different countries, comparing policy responses to COVID. As part of that study, we asked country teams to send us the representations of the disease incidence from their own countries. And this is a small selection of the graphs that were sent to us. There are two things that are noteworthy about these charts. One is the shape of the curve itself, showing that although it is the same pandemic, it has had very different degrees of intensity, severity, and duration in the countries that we're looking at. But a second point also worth noting is that the ways in which the countries represent themselves looks very different. So along the top row, you have Germany, and then you have Australia, and then you have India, and then down below you have Italy and Peru and China. So if you look, for instance, at the graph of China, where this disease originated, there on the bottom right, you will see that it was tamped down incredibly fast, whereas in most other countries, the curves are still rising, and you're getting first waves and second waves, and in some countries, third waves, with relevant restrictions coming into and out of play. So the pandemic looks different in the different countries. This is another chart of preparedness to meet crises of this sort, public health crises like a pandemic. This is the Global Health Security Index. And as in many of these maps, the lighter colors represent a happier place to be. So if you're yellow and sunny, that means you scored very high on the Global Health Security Index. And if you're deep red, it means you did not score so high. Now, if you put this map side by side with the first map I showed, you will see immediately that although Australia, which is highly prepared, has done relatively well in combating COVID-19, the US, which ranked first in the Global Health Security Index, has fared least well. And the African continent, which here is shown in pretty deep red, suggesting low preparedness, has by and large managed the pandemic better than many of the Western countries and the northern countries in general. So there is a paradox that preparedness and ability to manage do not match up cleanly and neatly, even though preparedness was supposed to be exactly for the purpose of dealing with this very kind of crisis. So that leads to a problem for the social sciences, and it is the problem that we have been investigating in our research project. So these differences have major political consequences. In the United States, we've recently been through a transition in power at the very top of the government. And here you see former Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, on the eve of the inaugural in Washington, D.C., commemorating the victims of COVID that have already passed the 400,000 mark and are rising week by week. And in the other smaller picture, you see a representation of what an inaugural ceremony in the US would have looked like, except that the American flags are replacing the people who should have been there. So these are consequential differences in policy responses in these countries. The US's failure to manage the disease has been responsible for even the rituals of our presidential transitions to look very different from the way they have looked throughout the 20th century, for instance. So if we go on, we see that there's a need to ask some pretty fundamental questions about how politics and expertise tie together. And it's useful to be reminded of these basics and fundamentals. So the key question for democracy in political theory has always been, why should the few be empowered to rule for the many? Why should we each be governed by governments that are often politically and geographically distant from us, and in any case, people whom we don't know and whom we did not directly empower? What is the theory of democracy? But today, in modern times, in contemporary times, there is another key question, and the key question for modernity is why should the few be empowered to know for the many? So as questions of governance increasingly relate to expertise, as our political leaders increasingly make their decisions on the basis of what experts tell them, it's very important for us to develop a theoretical set of answers to this key question for modernity. My position on this, developed across now some 4 decades of research on expertise and politics, is that it makes sense in some sense to talk about 2 parallel constitutions in the modern world. One of them concerns questions of political delegation. The other concerns questions of epistemic delegation. So the delegation of power, pure and simple, and the delegation of the power to know in a more complex way. We find that the political delegation, the constitutions that govern political delegation, are explicit. You can point to particular times and places and indeed documents. The US Constitution is a piece of paper that is stored in the National Archives, and you can go and visit it. And in it, there are explicit answers to questions of the sort that you see under the heading explicit in this diagram. So is power being exercised, and if so, how is it authorized? What are the limits on those powers? How do we know those limits and what can be done or not done? Who can challenge those decisions, by what processes, and what is the nature of representation? Who is allowed to challenge or question a decision? But side by side with that, we have a completely implicit other set of delegations, and that set of delegations concerns the power to know. So in a world without borders, in particular, the world of science and technology, how should people know collectively for themselves? Does it make sense to talk about something called epistemic subsidiarity, in which particular political systems allow their citizens to come to different understandings of who is an expert and how experts should pump their knowledge into the political system? In the epistemic delegation column, you also find that increasingly the nature of the authority is predictive. Science tells us what's going to happen to the future of COVID, the future of climate change, the future of many other conditions that plague us and to some degree also bless us in the contemporary world. So how is expertise constructed when the power exceeds the lifetimes of normal human beings? And what is the nature of ethics and responsibility in a world that is governed by experts? So to delve into that set of questions a little more deeply, one has to think about science itself as exercising a kind of constitutional role in the contemporary world. Why do I say constitutional? Well, science provides a common baseline for accountability, but science enters politics not as a set of facts, not as a process in and of itself, but through expertise, and expertise is a very human function. Expertise is exercised by experts. Experts themselves govern by appeals to science. We all understand phrases like sound science and good science, and this is something that experts often use as part of their linguistic baggage. So there is de facto in the modern world a tacit constitutional compact that people who can rightfully invoke the idea of science are entitled to tell us how we should think about the world, and therefore also how we should behave in that world. Science has its own standards of what counts as sound or good, and various eras in the sociology of knowledge have attempted to come to grips with these questions of what counts as quality and virtue in the sciences. One famous example in the United States was propounded by the distinguished sociologist Robert K. Merton back in the early 1970s, and it's often referred to as the QDOS framework, referring to the first letter of each of his norms. So Merton suggested that science has a special set of epistemic virtues resulting from, first, its communalism, that science is held in common regardless of where people are. It's universalism. Scientific claims are independent of the places in which they're produced. It's disinterestedness. Science is free from political bias and interest, and it's organized skepticism. Science is always open to questioning by peers. Politicians historically have picked up on these ideas because they too find it useful to appeal to science. So this is George Bush Elder speaking in 1990 at the National Academy of Sciences, and he pretty much buys into Robert Merton's ideas about what gives science its virtue. Science, he said, like any field of endeavor, relies on freedom of inquiry, and one of the hallmarks of that freedom is objectivity. So here, the President of the United States takes objectivity as something given in the nature of the scientific enterprise, and then he goes on to list a number of areas. The epidemic of his time, AIDS, features among them, but also climate change and genetic engineering and food additives. These are of particular concern to this audience. And he says that in each of these areas, government relies on the impartial perspective of science. So there he's buying into the Mertonian idea that science can be impartial. But cracks have appeared in that social compact, and these cracks have widened since the beginning of this century. The cracks are symbolized by a gradual turning away into what everybody today recognizes as the post-truth era. In America, characteristically, one of the defining moments of that switch came about not in the political system, but in the comedy shows that caricatured the political system. Stephen Colbert, the famed American comedian, lampooned American politics under President George W. Bush, the son of George Bush the Elder, as a no-fact zone. And Frank Rich, at that time a distinguished columnist for the New York Times, wrote way back in 2006, 15 years ago, that in retrospect, the defining moment of the political campaign of that year may have been back in April when Mr. Colbert appeared at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, and he called it, Frank Rich called it a cultural primary. Indeed, the word truthiness soon appeared in Wikipedia, which has become now the repository of English language and to some extent other language common knowledge as well. And truthiness was described as a quality characterizing truth that a person claims to know intuitively. So science, instead of being the product of disinterestedness and organized skepticism, as Merton thought, is now something that can arise from the subjective perceptions of people. That was how Colbert defined truthiness. In other words, it's a gut assessment, a subjective emotional assessment of the truth value of propositions. So side by side with this kind of cultural appreciation of what has happened to science and scientific knowledge, sociologists of knowledge today adopt a very different posture with respect to the foundations of science and with respect to its credibility from the way in which Robert Merton thought about it. And very briefly put, whereas Robert Merton's idea of science relied on the notion that science operates in a realm apart, subject to its own norms, the framework of Mode 2 of scientific knowledge points out that science is increasingly produced in context of application. That is, science is only relevant, people buy into it because it does work for us, because it is sociologically significant for us, and it is therefore also transdisciplinary, generated in many different contexts. Scientists themselves are said to be increasingly aware of the societal implications of their work, and I think this very symposium points to the truth of that proposition. And publics too have become increasingly conscious that science and technology affect their interests and values. So the whole idea of a disinterested science makes no sense anymore. In the 80 years or so since Robert Merton's time, we have advanced to needing a very different framework for thinking about the science and society relationship. Nevertheless, policymakers still cling to essentially that Mertonian view. And back in 1983, the United States National Research Council offered a framework for thinking about the relationship between science and policy, which we might think of as a separatist strategy. It laid out a framework that is still incredibly widely used and bought into by policymakers. It suggested that one can separate a largely scientific domain called risk assessment from a largely political domain called risk management. And you see in that diagram risk assessment occupying the middle bank of the process, separated by a vertical line from the politics of risk management that are only thought to come into play later. My own research in this area goes back quite a long time by now. In 1990, I published a book called The Fifth Branch, and in that book, I suggested that science advisors operate more as policymakers than as scientists living in a separate world. But I also suggested that it is not necessary to buy into truthiness just because we've given up on the idea of a separatist domain of truth. One can, to some extent, achieve a degree of reliability in science. I called that state of play serviceable truths, truths that need not be taken as true for all time or all places, but they do the work that we want from reliable knowledge. And it is possible to legitimate science even if we recognize that science occupies a boundary space between objective knowledge, idealized objective knowledge, and pure subjectivity symbolized by the word truthiness. I talked in The Fifth Branch about regulatory science as an epistemic and political hybrid, and this chart, which I will not go into in detail, pointed out that the context in which pure science is carried out differ greatly from the context in which regulatory science is carried out, and the systems of accountability are different. Whereas pure science relies on the judgment of peers, regulatory science is accountable to political institutions as well. And if we think about the present moment and think about the different scientific advisory bodies that are operating in different countries, including the Conseil Scientifique in France itself, these are accountable to the media and to the public, as well as to government and, of course, to the experts who constitute such bodies. Nevertheless, we continue to value facts, and in this attempt at a political theorization, we need to understand why we value facts, even though increasingly we have pointed out that the generation of facts has become a collective political enterprise with different channels of accountability and responsibility that look very different from what we associate with pure or ivory tower science. So one of the ways in which people in the policy world have tried to come to grips with this altered situation is represented in this other diagram, which also comes from a report of the US National Research Council. And this was from a report that was generated in 1996. It does not have the same recognition as the 1983 report, but it propounded the idea of the analytic deliberative model. The analytic deliberative model says that we have to have a domain of analysis, which looks perhaps rather like the 1983 idea of a domain of risk assessment, but that it has to be in continuous and recursive conversation with the political arena. So it is not a linear model. Those back and forth arrows suggest that no analysis is going to serve a function unless it is in conversation with political deliberation, and political deliberation that is supposed to yield decisions has to keep going back and do analysis as well. So one might wonder about how this analytic deliberative model can serve us better in the situation that we're in and in the politics of expertise in the 21st century writ large. One feature of this politics of expertise that we have to take better account of, certainly if we want to theorize the place of expertise in modernity, is that each nation, each polity, and sometimes even large organizations that are not nations have their own answers to what counts as reliable knowledge. In my own work and that of my colleagues, we refer to this specificity of public knowledge as civic epistemologies. Civic because citizens, political systems have to buy into the ways in which knowledge is produced, and epistemologies because they relate to the ways in which we know something. So if you look at the US, the UK, and Germany, three countries that I have looked at in detail, you find that the procedures for producing and validating public knowledge are different from one another. The underlying assumptions are different, the procedures are different, and I will not go into this chart in detail for lack of time, but it is laid out in my book Designs on Nature, which compares the regulatory systems of these three countries as they have dealt with biotechnology. But more important for our purposes today, if we look at these constructions of expertise to answer the civic epistemologies of the different contextual sites, we find that there is a way in which expertise itself is fractionated out into different bodies of knowledge. Now here I'm using the multiple meanings of the English word body, and it will not be the same in all languages. But in English, one can talk about bodies of knowledge, one can talk about the bodies of the individual experts, and one can also talk about bodies that are collective, committees. And again, across the three countries that I've talked about, you find that there is a different way of establishing what is the right body of knowledge or the good body of knowledge, what is the right way to select the good expert, and what counts as good committees. So for instance, just to take one of these lines, in the US, advisory committees are supposed to be pluralist in the knowledges that they represent, whereas in Germany, they're supposed to be pluralist in the constituencies that they represent. And German advisory committees tend to be far more widely representative of the different interest formations in society than US committees by and large. Going on, one can see that the epistemic virtues that one expects in these different systems are also different. So broadly, I'm making the claim that collective knowledge making is a contextualized enterprise, and even basic terms such as what counts as objectivity and what counts as sound science or good science vary across political systems. So if you look at the bodies of knowledge in the US, there has been a strong commitment that science is independent of politics, and it's possible to attain a view from nowhere where all shred of political interest has been separated out from science. Paradoxically, this has resulted in exactly the types of conflicts that we see today, that there are many different claimants about what counts as good science, and the US is singularly unable to forge a consensus on what good science is. Whereas in countries where there is more of a tradition of letting the politics visibly get into the production of knowledge, one finds a somewhat more stable approach to the generation of collective knowledge. So these are things that comparative analysis reveals about the connection between different normative presumptions about expertise and the ways in which expertise is able to function in a political system. I've suggested that one can then use these analytic devices to create what I've called a cascade of deference, that when science enters into the political arena and we want science to be doing work for us, we can think about the degrees to which it is appropriate for science to become politicized, in other words, for science to be answerable to politics. In this cascade, if there is a very strong consensus people accept that a fact is a fact, then we can treat it as objectivity and have a high degree of deference. But if it is plainly a matter of expert consensus, that is, most experts agree, but it's not yet attained the status of a universally accepted fact, then we should question the nature of the expertise that produced that consensus. If there is no consensus, then a precautionary stance may be appropriate, and we should look to alternatives and think about other ways in which we might achieve the results that we want to achieve without violating people's civil liberties, for example. And last but not least, where there is genuinely complete uncertainty about what is going to happen, it may be very significant and important to have epistemic subsidiarity, an allowance for different political systems to understand and carry out their decision-making in accordance with the dictates of the political constitution and not an epistemic one. So how does that translate back quickly into health risk governance in the post-world that we're living in? And here I'm making a reference to the fact that people call it post-human, post-modern, even post-truth. So how do we think about how to govern in this post-everything world? I think we need to resurrect the idea of a constitutional convention and think about what that constitutional convention might look like. There in the background, you see a picture of Thingvellir, which is the place in Iceland where a millennium ago, the first constitutional convention of the northern world was allegedly held. So what should, a millennium later, a constitutional convention for the 21st century look like? And there are some grand challenges for expertise in this constitutional moment. First of all, one has to think about institutional devolution. We have taken what used to be a widely understood consensus in the modern world about the relationship between expertise and democracy. And in place of that, we have resurgent populisms in different parts of the world, nationalism redux. We have expanded time horizons and heightened demands for people, citizens, to be involved in the making of expertise. And as a result of particularly the appearance of the new media, we have a frayed set of gatekeeping arrangements. You can no longer turn to a single voice of authority. So these are challenges that expertise must face in this constitutional moment, and that has political implications and consequences. We must be vigilant that we're asking the right questions, and for that, it's always necessary to go back to the public and return to that deliberative part of the analytic deliberative model. We have to remember that representation matters. Who speaks for experts is an urgent and crying question. And we have to re-theorize the nature of reason in the contemporary world. There is not a singular way of producing reason. So with that, let me stop for today, and thank you very much for your attention.
I will ask you just a few questions for the moment. You seem to advocate for a constitutional convention. What such a convention look like? What would it look like?
Well, that, of course, itself remains to be invented. One of the things that it will not look like is Thingvellir. It will not happen in one place, not even in the sacred places of democracy, such as France or the US. I think it's going to be virtual, and it's going to be incremental and procedural. One of the things that we're doing in connection with biotechnology with some colleagues is that we've advocated for something that we call the Global Observatory for Genome Editing, but it could be equally applied to any new and emerging technology, in which we will hope to collect and analyze the different answers that people are giving to this set of questions about how to develop norms in emergent areas of science and technology. So the first thing to do is to map the territory and see the different ways in which people are approaching it, and then to foster the kinds of forums in which these underlying presumptions that are often unstated will actually be forced to confront each other.
Would it be created? How would it be created? By the scientists themselves, or would it be created by under the UN authority, for instance?
So, not only by scientists themselves. I mean, it is obviously a fundamental presupposition, not just of my work, but the entire body of work in science and technology studies, that the whole idea that scientists can go off and deliberate these questions by themselves does not make sense anymore, because the questions, the epistemic questions and the normative questions, are entirely bound up together all the time. And this symposium is an excellent example of this, because it's bringing together scholars of all different stripes. So it's important for people to be questioning each other across disciplines. That is one of the fundamental points. The UN system, I think it'd be a little naive to say that this is going to be governed by the UN system. I think it's not going to be governed from one place. It's more a matter of stitching together the kinds of initiatives that already are happening in different places. And it's a kind of meta deliberation on much more focused deliberations that are happening already. This is going to take time. I mean, it took a lot of time for the constitutional democracies of the world to emerge. I mean, arguably 1789 was not the date, 1776 was not the date. The post-war decolonization may have been closer to some set of dates. So, you know, if we're talking about hundreds of years to get to a new understanding, we've had 400 years since the beginnings of the scientific revolution. We may need 400 more years. So, you know, I'm not presuming to say that it will happen in this place or at this time. It's an ongoing process of reflection.
Of course. Now, you referred to the 1983 NRC Red Book model of analysis, and you quote it as a separate strategy between research, risk assessment, and risk management. How come the 1996 NRC model, which upholds an analytic deliberative model, which you quote as undervalued, wasn't successful or didn't get more support from the scientific community?
Well, it pains me to say that one of the responses that the scientific community needs to consider is a greater degree of humility about the nature of their own conclusions, and also about the power that those conclusions should have in the world at large. Now, I happen to speak from a political culture, the American one, that probably buys into the separatist model more so than most other ones. So in Europe, for instance, the idea of precaution is much more widely accepted, whereas in America, we've spent a great deal of time saying that precaution holds back innovation because it forces you to look before you leap, and that it's a prescription for not getting anything done. So on the whole, Americans have preferred a system in which you do something first and then you pick up the negative consequences after the fact. So scientists, I think, need to be taught that even though, you know, publishing an article means that you're pretty sure that the findings are right, that this does not translate well into the wider world, that you need to have conversations. One of the things I would point out about the difference between the 1983 report and the 1996 report from the National Research Council is that the 1996 report was led by a committee that was far more diverse intellectually than the 1983 report. And so one of the important points to mention specifically today is that this whole interaction between science and society that has been playing out in real time has not yet been picked up into the policy world, nor by policy-relevant scientists. And there are signs that cracks may be appearing of a beneficial sort there. So a couple of days ago, last Friday, President-elect Biden announced that there's going to be a deputy director advising his Office of Science and Technology Policy, who is specifically entrusted with the portfolio for science and society. And she is a scholar in science and technology studies. And this is the first time that there's going to be such a figure in high places. Again, this is a sign of a recognition, even in America, that this translation exercise has to happen in a different way from the way that it has happened before.
Yeah, there's a progress going on. Thank you, Sheila. Just going to stay with us because we will have a Q&A session afterwards. I would like to turn to Ortwin Renn. Hello, sir. You are a scientific director at the International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. You also are a professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment at the University of Stuttgart. And you direct a nonprofit company which is called Dialogic, which is a research institute for the investigation of communication and participation processes. And your research interests include risk governance, stakeholder and public involvement in environmental decision making. Let's listen to you. Director at the International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. You also are a professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment at the University of Mr. Renn, I think you are listening over YouTube. Dialogic, which is a research institute for the investigation of communication and participation processes. And your research interests include risk governance, stakeholder and public involvement in environmental decision making. Let's listen to you. Director at the International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. You also are a professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment at the University of Mr. Renn, I think you are listening over YouTube. Mr. Renn, I'm sorry, you must have cut your microphone and we don't hear you. Could you talk again, please? We can't hear you at the moment, I'm sorry. Maybe you're listening to us over YouTube, which means that we have a delay in your answer as well. I don't know if you could keep on speaking. We can't hear you at the moment. I'm sorry. So maybe we will try to fix this, and we will move on to Daniel Agacinski. Daniel Agacinski, so I'll switch to French now. Daniel Agacinski, ça va être beaucoup plus.
Mr. Agacinski, you are here with us in the room. You're going to keep your mask on. That's fine. Since we are the sufficient distance apart, we have a large studio. I will take mine off. So, before we go back to Ortwin Renn later on, we're going to hear you first. You are a professor of philosophy. You have been the author of 2 reports, one on discourse and practice of mediation between citizens and administrations. That was in 2019. And another report from 2018, Expertise in Democracy, Coping with Mistrust. You are the Delegate General for Mediation for the institution of the Defender of Public Rights. It's here to defend those whose rights have not been respected. So let us now listen to you on this question of mistrust. Thank you. Thank you to all of the organizers. Thank you to Anses for allowing me to participate in this symposium. We hope that the communication links are going to be re-established. We're delighted. I'm delighted to be here with these organizations, and it is linked up with the institution for which I was working when I delivered the report. Thank you again for inviting me to address this question, which I think is we are right to ask, the question of expertise, the credibility of expertise, 2 words that go together well, as the Beatles might say. So this brings us back to the question of what is expertise, as Sheila Jasanoff was just talking about. And I think she was talking about how expertise is composed. I would talk about its reception, its perception. And so let's go back a little bit to the different categories as defined by Aristotle, about how this is made up. So being an expert, this is not in and of itself a discipline. It is a situation. And this is why sociologists, when they look at expertise, they examine the situation in which expertise happens. It is a position within a broader relationship. It is not a substance in and of itself. An expert, if you like, is a function. It is a role. And so what role? It is the role that when you are called on by another individual, not instead of another individual, but to shed light on something in order to allow another person or actor to take action. And as the holder of knowledge that the other person, the other party is not privy to, or at least anyway at that time. So you are called on. Why? Because you are believed to have access to this information, to this knowledge, and because you are able to make the information available to others, to explain it without allowing any personal opinions or preferences to intervene. And this is why when you know, I make a decision about what I'm buying for my home, I will look to an expert in that situation. It's the same thing in public policy. It is the situation that makes an expert, and there is no reason for it to be a particular specialist from a particular discipline in a particular problem. So, for example, if I'm the Minister of National Education, I want to change the school timetable or the dates of holidays, I will look at different profiles. I could look to different profiles, chronobiologists, economists, child psychologists, cognitive scientists, school inspectors, as well as people from the media, whose role is also to inform. And so as a public decision maker or as a policy maker, I need to go and find the expertise that I think is useful, not just the opinion that I agree with. And this notion of general interest is extremely important. So again, expertise and credibility is also a relational situation. What do we think is worthy of being taken seriously and being believed in a given situation? And this is precisely what we need in expertise in order for the situation of expertise to be meaningful. So knowing what you're talking about and making this available in a transparent way, without these two, there is no expertise. And so this notion of credibility is the quality that we put in an individual when we go and consult them. This doesn't mean there is absolute trust, but it means that we are going to accept what the expert says as knowledge that is being shared with me before I then go and take a decision. And so a relationship of trust is absolutely essential in order for this relationship to occur. And so what do we do with mistrust? What is mistrust? This is the definition that we gave is a situation of a person who fears being cheated. It is not cynicism in the sense that you refuse to believe anything from anyone. That's slightly different. So why are we talking a lot about this issue of mistrust towards experts and mistrust of experts? It is not the direct opposite of trust. It is a disposition whereby trust is not taken for granted. In French, we say that you earn trust drop by drop, and then you lose it in gallons at a time. It's very difficult to earn trust. I don't know if there was a golden age of trust where the words of scientific authorities were taken and believed immediately. But the situation that we're in now has been the case, I think, and increasing for 30 or 40 years. There's an ambivalent effect here of an increase in the level of education of the overall population. There have been a series of health or environmental scandals. I think we're all familiar with them. Mediator, the contaminated blood, asbestos, all of these things have left an imprint in public opinion. And at the end, you have this presumption of credibility of expertise. This situation is reversed. And so you don't have this automatic trust in experts. But actually, what we're going to do is question the why these people are trusted and the questioning of authority. And so being a title holder in and of itself is not sufficient to put you in a position of authority and automatic credibility. So we need to have this diagnosis. If you look at the opinion polls and the surveys, which is one way of measuring credibility and trust, but obviously this is always very difficult to measure. When you look at questions about scholars, scientists, researchers, doctors, there is a level that is far, far higher than other categories, such as nurses or firemen, which far, far lower than people in government, politicians, and sadly those journalists in the media as well. Sergi had carried out a study during the pandemic, researchers at Sciences Po. They asked questions about their trust in scientists and doctors and also in government. And they created this ad hoc committee of scientists advising government. And they found that there was, they had a level of intermediary trust. So higher than the government, but lower than scientists. And you see this all over in Britain, in France, in Germany. In France, this has been a little bit lower because structurally the mistrust towards governments and journalists is higher in France than in other areas. But doctors are at the top of this ranking, if you like, in all countries. So the mistrust in France is particularly focused on government and decision makers. And as Sheila Jasanoff was saying earlier, this should be analysed and seen and taken as such. And so how do we... so the types of questions and the actors in this expertise, when they are, even when they are not taking the decision themselves, this is the difference between an expert and a decision maker. When they are stakeholders, it is when they become part of the decision-making process, even if they don't take the decision themselves, that they become particularly targets of this mistrust. And what causes this mistrust is not the process, the procedure by which the expertise, the knowledge is created, but rather its uses for private technologies or for public decisions. As I was saying earlier, it is earned drop by drop, lost by the gallon, and there is this effect of contagion. It can be passed from one institution to another. So if you put yourself in the situation of the institutions who are going to try and use the credibility of individuals or these authorities to use and to apply and to have their decisions accepted, they can suffer as well. It doesn't always work. And this is really the gamble of the public instrumentalization of science. So if you decide to hide as a policymaker, if you decide to hide behind this authority of the scientist and say, if I'm not making this decision on the basis of a conviction, of a political or personal conviction, but on the basis of this authority, well, what happens? How will the opponents choose to attack me on this? Well, they will oppose not only the policy itself, but they will oppose also the expertise that is used to defend this decision, or even the discipline itself, the scientific discipline itself behind it. And so you have the it's a lose-lose game, this public instrumentalization of science, lose for the public institutions and lose for the experts themselves who lose credibility. And all of this encourages, fosters the emergence of alternative facts. So it's not just it's not just, I think it's not just the conspiracy theorists or populists who are to blame. The standard response of this contagion due to a relationship that is too close between these groups has been limited. So a lot of progress has been made with independence and transparency, and obviously individual expert, even if you remove all of the key conflicts of interest and so on, no individual is entirely pure and completely independent, and we cannot exclude instrumentalization altogether, given the role of the policymaker. And always an opinion is never completely neutral. It is always part of a spectrum of action. And this brings us back to the question of credibility. What is the quality, the quality par excellence of expertise is not production. What makes scientists, because they can have they can make statements that are completely backed up scientifically in the discipline, but it is of no use to public policy. So things have to be relevant as well. Is their ability to be inserted or to insert themselves in a complex situation at a time where it is relevant, and to shore up and defend a decision or a particular action. And so once again, it always has to be situated in a number of disciplines in a particular moment at a particular time. So guiding a process or a procedure within, once again, a spectrum of actions. And this characteristic does not lead to relativism, as we sometimes hear, but it allows us to compare the value regime, the value hierarchy, and the scientific information itself. This expertise is linked to scholarly rationality, the scholarly rationale, and also the rationale of public policy, the means and the ends. And this is we call, you have a rationalist regime and a truth-based regime, but this is perhaps another debate. I think it's rather more difficult for a scientist to understand is this notion of political rationale. There is a form of comfort here to divide the world into two parts, so that you have a rational, methodological form of action for scientists, rationalism, pure rationalism in its purest form, and the notion of values and ideas and beliefs, which is completely irrational, if you like, and led by passions, which leads to an endless debate about interpretations, interests, and so on. So this is why the expert has its justification for being. It is not just any information that can shed light on any kind of power, and not any kind of information that will shed light on a decision. This does not mean that we should reject the whole notion of expertise or experts altogether. On the contrary, we need to understand that mobilizing knowledge for a particular end or for a particular purpose means understanding its function, that it can shed light on a particular goal. If we take the example once again of statistical expertise, and again in French, you know, you count what counts for us. We look at what is useful and what is valuable for us. And if I can just conclude rather quickly to come back to this question of the notion of credibility, the title that we gave to this was Coping with Mistrust. Why this idea of coping with, if it is a problem for expertise? This doesn't mean that people who are mistrustful are always right and we should always listen to them. But mistrust is here. It exists. It is a long process. It's taking new forms, but it has always been there. And we're this idea that we can re-establish trust overnight, I think is a false premise. It is not because people are conspiracy theorists or telling people that they are poorly educated or don't have enough knowledge. This isn't going to work either. I think that would be very wrong-headed. Understanding what this mistrust is really trying to say to authority and to the relationships of knowledge, I think, is a better way of doing things differently and a better way of handling mistrust. This expertise should be of interest to the public. They need to understand why it is useful, that it is serving their own interest, and we need to be perhaps explicit about how this serves the public interest. And in this way, we could challenge this mistrust. In this sense, I think the answer to the question of credibility in the issue of at which experts are asked to intervene should match those questions that citizens ask themselves and the way in which they are relating to these issues. Thank you very much, Daniel. So what you are really proposing is that we should incorporate experts and what they say. What does this mean? Challenging words. What do we do with this if this discourse is so disconnected from what experts are saying? Well, exactly. We should avoid trying to make it seem like they're answering the same question. When you ask an expert a question, when you ask an individual a question, I mean, it's the same for the Committee on Vaccination. They're not there to say when we should vaccinate people, but rather to convey questions, doubts, uncertainties that may well be obstacles to vaccination. I think the current situation is absolutely fascinating at the moment because without trust on the foundations for these decisions, it's not going to work. It is absolutely fundamental. The reason why people avoid or hesitate before getting vaccinated must be taken into account. And so the vocation of listening to the skeptical discourse, if you like, must be done because otherwise we disqualify people in both camps. If you don't share the same conviction from the beginning, well, then you end up completely divided. So you're talking about incorporating citizens' discourse and the concerns of citizens. I think this is rather different to incorporating skeptical discourse. This can be mistrustful in a way that is sometimes violent, sometimes forceful, when we deny, for example, or when people deny or challenge that the American presidential elections were carried out correctly. When you decide to take over Capitol Hill, this is perhaps one example. You're dealing with people who have reached a degree of mistrust or even skepticism that is difficult to regain. Well, this, once again comes back to the question of losing it, so earning it by drops and losing it by the gallon. The example that you've given of from the United States is interesting as well. Mistrust is not always a fact of public opinion. We heard, for example, at one point about all of the former presidents of France, irrespectively of their political background. They have an expert report, and they rely on that to decide to help them make a decision. And at the same time, they say, this is what the experts say, but I'm listening to people and to what the public says. So ambiguity has always been there, and it weighs heavily. And I think at the same time, it needs to be extracted from this instrumentalization. Coping with it is difficult. Citizens' discourse, citizens' words must be heard, must be listened to, must be taken into account in order to go beyond it, and in order to answer the right questions. So making progress in terms of the health impact, the societal impact, the environmental impact. Why have they not looked at a particular consequence of a particular technological intervention? Well, that is the opportunity to maybe move the limelight and to look at questions or practices that could potentially be dangerous. In France, there are two scientists that we have talked a lot about. Claude Allègre, Minister of Research at one point, who was a climate skeptic in France. He led the debate on this in France. In France, it has largely gone quiet. There don't seem to be very many strong climate skeptical voices. And with relation to the pandemic, you have Didier Raoult, a defender of hydroxychloroquine in combating this disease. How can we explain that major scientists take a road that leads away from reality in some sense? I think it's very important to understand the position of power relations between the scientific world. How do we understand it in the scientific world? On climate questions, it is not just by chance that major physicists have looked at this decision. The attention given to this will impact funding. You could reduce the importance of a particular funding because it can be seen as competing in their legitimacy. And if you look at medicine, the temptation to be seen as the savior who has the miracle molecule is very difficult to resist. Of course, we can add on layers of binary debates for and against, Le Parisien, a French newspaper, asked citizens, do you believe that hydroxychloroquine can cure this disease? I mean, things like that. I don't understand. It is quite an absurd question in my view. Initially, it was a rather different question that was asked. So you really have to think about the power relations that exist across the whole spectrum of human relations and the positions of different individuals on this spectrum.
And Mr. Renn, do you hear me? And most of us, most of all, can we hear you, Mr. Renn?
Yes, I hope so that you can hear me now. Yes.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. I'm very happy that it worked out. Yes, in the end.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Thanks very much for being here with us.
Yes, thank you very much.
So I'm not going to introduce you again because now everybody knows about you, but we'll listen to you with great pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much. I would like to explore a little bit together with you the nature of systemic risk and how it really relates to what we're talking about, the scientific approach in terms of risk analysis, but also in terms of risk communication. Next slide, please. The main key to my talk is the word systemic risk. And systemic risk means that we have a risk that we have a hard time to explore, that it is nonlinear in many of its consequences, that it has thresholds and very often at the tipping point, and that it also goes cross different territories and very often cross different sections. Next slide. This is all part of a risk perspective, and the risk perspective basically has two major components, and that makes it easy to handle even for very complex systems. Our first one is what we call a risk agent, and the second one is the risk absorbing system. The risk agent is the one that brings harm to the individual, to the target, or to the risk absorbing system, which could be an ecosystem, which could be a city, which could be a building or a human being. Now, the risk agent is the one that brings that harm. And interesting enough, there are not that many that can do that. And that is also one of the main virtues of riskinalities, if we can confine it basically to these various risk agents. And normally we're talking about three physical risk agents. That's energy, that's explosion, that could be radioactive radiation, that could be fire, all things kinetic energy, chemical energy, and so on. The second one, of course, is substance. So we have poisonous substances that can kill us, or substances that can have an impact on ecosystems. And the one that I don't have to explain very much, biota, or the viruses, and bacteria, fungi, and other kinds of biological hazards. And it's very clear that they have an impact on us, as we now witness. Then we have a couple of social risk agents, and if you were, very confined to only two, it's information and power, because information can kill. Wrong information very often has the ability to kill people, and information is also nothing else. Money is a part of information, and many other too. Well, we can take money separately, because all the issue of losses of money also an agent in terms of wealth and in terms of bringing people more or less material value. And power and violence, again, are very much related, but we can also confine it to power. So we have 5, or if you want 7 different agents. And the interesting thing about complex systems is that these agents are interconnected. And interconnection means that, you can start with something like a biota that we just have, a pandemic. That could lead that, people are not very careful in a chemical factory, put in some new substances in there, people are getting poisoned. Then it could lead to more physical energy releases in another factory. There is a lot of information out here, specifically about conspiracies, one of the things that have been mentioned several times during the talks earlier. And then, of course, we have a diffusion of power, which relates to interests and also to information that comes out. And that, of course, has an impact on how people behave. And this can, again, have impacts on physical energy, can have on substance and biota. So one thing that's very important in this is to see that these interaction of risk agents develop cascades of events, and that's something that is very important to look at, and that is where, of course, at least interdisciplinary sciences are urgently needed. So the emphasis in the risk perspective is on both things, a risk agent. We do have a lot of probabilistic risk analysis that do this. If we have to focus more on the risk absorbing system, so independent of the risk agent, we're talking about resilience or vulnerability analysis, because then we really concentrate on the target of the risk agent and whether that target is able or capable to deal and cope with major risk agents, meaning different stressors. Next slide, please. So on systemic thinking in risk, what we're talking about potential losses here is basically the breakdown of systems functionality. So it's not just, one individual who is being affected, but, for example, the systems of the hospital beds, the intensive care units, all of those things are part of the systems functionality. There is always the issue that we can affect other systems. So the health system that we are now looking at can have an impact, specifically the measures that we take on the economic system, on the social system, on the political system, then back to the health system again. So we have these multi-level interactions between different systems and their functionalities. In time dimensions, we have risk cascades that are going on with and between systems. And again, the risk agents play a major role in there because one infects the other. They're often related to what we call wicked problems. Sheila, I think, talked about it. And the governance requires a systems approach in form of integrated and target-oriented policy packages. So there's not just one policy that will meet all of this. We need also a whole set of packages in order to make sure that we get these different cascades, but also the cross impacts in different systems at the same time. Next slide. So this leads me again to the properties of systemic risk, and now more systematically, they are characterized by high complexity and interconnectivity, so they're all intertwined. We know that they are related stochastically. That means it's not, very rarely we have deterministic relationships, and we can see that also in the present crisis that, you know, whatever the vaccines are, or the probability of infection, or the probability of healing, is always a probability. One never has certainty here. Very often there is nonlinearity with tipping points. Nothing happens until a specific threshold is being exceeded. That's not so much in the case in the present crisis, but the present crisis, of course, because of its geometric growth of hazards, these thresholds can also occur. Very important cross-sectoral, so it goes beyond various policy sectors or policy arenas, very often transboundary, and very often leading to major ambiguities, interpretation, and management, very often attenuated. Seeing a lot of these global ecological crises, which are very often attenuated because, you know, all these, you know, complexities are too difficult to understand and to follow up and also to govern. But there are always ambiguities, and we can see this now in the crisis very much, that we have a whole set of explanations from the absurd with conspiracy theories to the very mathematically formulated kind of explanations. Next slide, please. So these are some examples of the systemic risks that I'm talking about. So it's the intensity of human intervention to the natural environment, climate changes very much, biodiversity, pollution, water scarcity, and others. It's the interconnectivity of technology, specifically cybersecurity, cybercrime, but also other major technical infrastructures like electricity and the blackout and others, water supply systems. It's economic collapse, specifically financial markets, as you see in 2008 and 2009, but also governance failures and economic trade wars, which we just have gone through, or have gone through. Hopefully they've gone over now. And then a very important element, the social side effects of modernization and globalization. So pandemics is one of them, increase of social disequity. It is the rise of populism and, you know, echo chambers and all kinds of anti-democratic movements. And distrust in government is certainly also something that could have a systemic risk impact. Next slide. Now the issue is, how do we deal with this? How do we cope with this? And that's systemic risk. That's a requirement for risk governance. Yet you can go on with the next slide. Though the nature challenges is that these risks are very often not easy to quantify, and very often cause effect assessments are not clearly give you a full picture of what you want to see, even in the present crisis, which is much more, you know, a conventional crisis in terms of infection. We still have a lot of uncertainties, and there's a lot of problems in quantification because things change so dramatically over time. There's an endless list of black swans, meaning that if we have very complex systems, it's very likely that small events can have a major impact, but there are a million small events that could be a trigger for major impacts, but we don't know which one. But since they're very unlikely, but there are many of them, one of them is very likely to happen. So there's a kind of a paradox here. There's an unlikely event, but there are a million unlikely events that are potential triggers for this kind of catastrophic event. We have a plurality of knowledge claims and assessment. Sheila talked about it. A lot of, we are not quite sure what is objective truth. There are a lot of truth claims, and some of them, as I said, absurd. Some of them are very reasonable. Some of them are possible, but very unlikely. And to put this all into a framework is not that easy. A lot of implications are counterintuitive, specifically if we have systemic nonlinear relationships. Trial and error is not a very good mode of going on. I mean, that's our normal learning mode. It's not good if we have thresholds, if we have tipping points, because before the tipping point, we always get positive feedback, so we do it again. And then as the tipping point is over, it's too late. So in that sense, we need to anticipate results before they become manifested. And there is a bad record for risk reduction worldwide. So there's something we can say. I mean, we have a lot of progress in occupational hazards, in car accidents, and all kind of things which are not systemic, which are kind of localized. Their risk reduction has worked very well. We're not that good into these systemic challenges. Next slide, please. Well, there's also something that is accompanying, is a societal context in which we operate. And the word post is, I think, is a very important word here. We talk a lot about post-modernity, post-structuralism, and so on. And post basically means that something is gone, but we don't know what the new thing is. And so we live in a little bit in a post-experience society where people don't have a lot of experiences with the things that they experience, meaning that there's not a lot of past lessons that they could learn from their own experience for dealing with new challenges that are facing them. And that often leads to kind of confusion, because you don't know what's right, because there are different competing claims of truth, and you don't know what's true, but your own experience doesn't tell you. So that's something that in the 20 or 50 years ago, people felt that they have a lot of experiences, and a lot of the things they could rest on their experience and then have some good plausible assumptions about what's true or not. Very often they're driven by beliefs and feelings. We talked about post-factual society. Post-factual society doesn't mean that people now lie more than they did before. Everybody lied in all phases of history, but that it's the border between what seems to be truthful and reasonable and what seems to be not truthful and not reasonable is fluid. And people have a hard time to make that kind of demarcation. And very often they retreat to the point, which is also, I think, a part of the populist movement, to say truth is what is desirable. So whatever I wish is also true. And that, of course, doesn't work. And then people get very frustrated. And then we can see all the kinds of reactions that we can see in real life. Distrust in elites, it's different in all of different countries. United States is pretty high. Germany is around the middle. In Sweden, it's pretty good with trust in the elites, but nevertheless, it's a part of the system, and is also this post-trust society where you don't trust anyone except maybe your direct peer group. Again, the group that does preach what you like them to preach, sort of the confirmation bias involved in there. And lastly, that there's a lot of ambiguity to that people just not even know what's true, but also what's good or bad. So this is a kind of area of confusion, and that of course links with the kind of also more modest approaches of science of what they can do in terms at least of truth. Next slide, please. So we need to have a model of integration for governance for these kind of systemic risks that I just talked about, and as I said, COVID-19 is an example there. So we need a very good approach that links risk assessment, so the physical assessment, or of the not only physical, also social assessment, but it's the agents and the interaction with the risk absorbing system. But it needs to include risk perception, because these perceptions also have an impact on people's behavior. And I think what we need to avoid is a totally, relativistic view of these kinds of knowledge claims, because I think some are absurd and others are not. We need some kind of staggering here. I think Sheila made it very nice with the objectivist and till over the precautionary to the last thing is more or less mediated. But it needs to include the kind of social constructions people have. Otherwise, we miss the point. We need a concept that links physical and environmental risk analysis with financial, economic, and social risk, because in a systemic world, they're all interconnected. And if you optimize one, you really do it on the expense of the other one. So you just put the buck from one to the other. And thirdly, I think it's very important to really address the properties of systemic risks. So we have to have a good response to the confusion elements that I just mentioned, the populist movement, the conspiracy theories, some of the social fallacies that I pointed out. But at the same time, I think you need to have an inclusive governance to bring in the stakeholders, bring in the public, in order to make them a part of the governing system rather than just subject to the governing system. Next slide. Now, this is the IRGC risk governance model that I would like just to show you briefly. This is an attempt to get to kind of systemic risk governance and to see what can we do in terms of regulation, but also in terms of just risk management. And what you see here is that we start out with what we call a pre-estimation, that the framing of the whole question, because that's very important, is that we need to include the social constructions of those that are somehow related or affected by the risk. Then you need to have an assessment or appraisal there, and it could be both the physical drivers as well as the social and political drivers need to be included in there, though that's something, this is new also, the concerns that people have. Then you get to the evaluation, because it's a multi-criteria evaluation. You never have one criterion, one number doesn't suffice for the kind of management decisions we have to make. And there's also prioritization that has to be done, trade-offs have to be made, that leads to management. And then of course we start the whole cycle all over again. And that's based on a conceptual framework in which we have, of course, financial and technical capacities to doing this. We have a whole set of different partial and also pluralized values and interests. Next slide, please. One of the main elements there is the issue of you can show the whole slide here. Is the issue of public involvement. As I said, we need to have something that is based on good assessment, so we need that, but we also need the inclusion of the various stakeholders, and this is another thing by the IRGC developed. This is the risk participation escalator. And what you can see is, if you go up the ladder from a very simple risk where you really just need agency staff to deal with it, it's not that important. If it's just a risk that is very complex, then you better have good expertise in there. It's not so important to have all the stakeholders involved, because once you know the complexity, you have either the legal ground or a social consensus on what to do. If you have a lot of uncertainty, it's different, because then you don't know who is taking, let's say, the risk of uncertainty. Is it the risk bearer or the risk carrier or the inducer of the risk? And there you need a lot of stakeholder participation, involvement, to make sure that everybody is comfortable with the kind of uncertainty that we have. And if you have a lot of ambiguity, if it's really contested on what we can do, we need even a much more societal participation. Now, it doesn't mean that these columns are, strictly divorced, and then you can go back and forth a little bit, but it also prevents that we do trivial things with a huge inclusive governance approach that would just overstress all the governance systems, and at the same time be sure that we understand what kind of risk is there. And if we have systemic risks, my plea is to be always on the right side. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of ambiguity. So we need a strongly inclusive approach. Next slide. So let me come to my conclusions. So next slide again, we have 2 slides left. Let me first again say something about the properties of systemic risks. These systemic risks, just like the pandemics that we were just witnessing, is high complexity. It's cross-sectoral and cross-boundary cascading effects. They go above all the various kind of distinctions that we have among ministries or among risk management agencies. So they go back and forth from physical to social to political risks, and they have, in the time dynamic structure, a lot of cascading impacts into various directions. There's always this stochastic relationships between cause and effects. Talked about this, it's a very difficult thing in terms of risk communication. If you have a stochastic risk, you always have kind of exceptions. And if people don't like what you're saying, they always focus on the exceptions. For example, the ones that don't want to be vaccinated say, oh, yes, there's 5% where it doesn't work. And then, we never get certainty. There's a nonlinear functional relationship, which makes it difficult to predict and to really rely on plausibility. And then tipping point makes it even worse. And then there's also the lack of attendance. The required management strategies are, if you have a lot of interconnected risk agents and you don't know the cascading effect between them, then it is a very good strategy to rely on the risk absorbing system. Make it as resilient as possible. Try a lot of unplausible scenarios. They won't happen, but if your system works with those or is able to cope with these unlikely scenarios, it will probably also cope with another one that will happen. So in that sense, resilience approaches is very good if you cannot really reduce the risk agents. There is important to have this unlikely stress scenarios and that you can test through and focus on combinations of risk agents and corresponding risk cascades. We call this a morphological method, in which you start to say, okay, how could these risk agents be combined? Can we imagine a scenario in which information leads to physical impacts, the physical impacts lead to chemical impacts, the chemical impact lead to power structure, so on. So we can really, design almost stories, narratives with these risk agents, and then it's good to test them out. What would happen if some of these scenarios would actually come true? Next slide, please. So in terms of risk governance, we need a synthesis of 4 steps. Framing, what kind of frames are actually there and how can we deal with them? Assessment, physical and social, then multi-criteria evaluation, and then go into management and monitoring. And focus on risk agents interactions, very important if we think about the systemic risks, and also on inclusiveness in terms of governance and this kind of focus on resilience. Risk communication, very important, is addressing all these post-X tendencies, so post-factual, post-trust, post-ethics, post-democracy, whatever we have. I think it's a very important element in communication, because this is a kind of confusion that pops up because we don't know what happens, after the post, and that, I think, is a clear sign that there is we cannot resolve it. It's not an issue of resolving, but it's an issue of addressing. And using the risk participant escalator could help to, to find the right, proper way of inclusion for the right type of problem. So in the end, and that's my last sentence then, what we need is an integrated governance approach for systemic risks, providing understanding, orientation, strategies, and co-production of knowledge and action. And then I think we will be best prepared or better prepared for these kind of systemic risks than we are now. Thank you very much.
Very much. Better prepared. That's what you told us. Huh? Okay, you're quite humble, I may say. We have a question over the internet for you, and here it is. How to ensure a balanced approach of inclusiveness and to ensure that some stakeholders do not gain too much influence according to their specific resources and their specific interests?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I hear both voices, always the French and the English in parallel. So excuse me if I'm not getting it totally, but I tried. So you talked about the balancing. I think what's very important is that it's not that we just juxtapose it. I think what we've done in the past was we had experts coming in, they said what is the right thing to do, then we went out to communicate it, and if we got some stakeholders saying no, we tried somehow to integrate them into the policy process, I think. Pardon me?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead. We're listening to you.
You can hear me good?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, prima. Yes, so what I wanted to say is that the interaction between the various parts of the public, the science, the policymakers can work together, what we call a co-creative process. So the systemic part or the systematic part of science can help to deliver cause-effect relationships in complex structure as far as we can. A lot of stakeholders can bring in their experiences to say, what have we learned in the past? What has really worked? Even not knowing exactly what the causal relationships are. And a lot of the science, a lot of the citizens can come in and say, what is the concern for us? So what is our main concerns for dealing with this kind of issue? And if you bring all of this together, then I think we have a much better way to develop robust strategies.
Do you have the feeling that the integrated governance approach that you're advocating for is at least partially implemented by health and environmental agencies throughout the world?
Yeah, I hope I understand you correctly. As I said, I hear both languages. On the right ear I have French and the left is English. Yes, I think the threat in terms of health is one that I think is very, the last pandemic, I think, has been, a very good example of this. I mean, we've seen first that the virologists were asked to come in front, and they were pretty much, have a consensus about what to do. And then we found out that we have a lot of secondary impacts. People had to stay home, and then, of course, we had more home violence. We could see that economic actors had a hard time to go along. We have seen more bankruptcies, then people had health problems again. So we can see all these complex structures. And if that happens, I think the virologists were not able to give you better answers. I mean, they were just saying, well, we know a lot about virology, but, I don't know what to do with schools. And some virologists were very modest and say, please ask others, like education specialists. But very often it was not education specialists. It was much better to ask the parents and ask the teachers, and to see what they had to say, because they had immediate experience. We didn't have really a lot of systematic knowledge what school children will do if they're locked up in rooms. I mean, there's some research about it, but not that much. So we had to live on what the kind of life experiences were of the people who were involved. And I think what we didn't do well is to get these kinds of different knowledge camps together in due time to say, okay, what is the best way to make these trade-offs between, protecting people against the virus, but at the same time protecting school children for whatever, home violence, I mean, that's only one example, or bankruptcy, or economic downfall, or other kinds of social impacts. And all of that needs to be balanced with each other. So we need this kind of balancing approach to make these trade-offs. And I believe that science was important, also social science, also interdisciplinary science, but science alone could not answer these questions. And policymakers, with all their wisdom, also had, I think, trouble. We needed the experience of people who have been affected. We needed, I think, also kind of a preference structure of people, what is more valuable to them. And I think these kinds of inputs would have been very good in order to really come up with a balanced policy.
Now, when we talked over the phone, you told me about a specific new type of stakeholder that that you would like to see the emergence of and that's people who you call brokers in science. And in your idea, they would be there over the internet, they would be independent, they would be able to give balanced views on questions such as how to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, or should we eat meat or not. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think that's a very important element, and I haven't really put a lot of focus on this during the 20 minutes that I was allowed to talk. The one thing is that, in complex issues, we have a whole set of scientific answers, but it's not arbitrary. And I think that's something that's very difficult to understand for many people who've gone to school, have gone physics, and physics said, well, A plus B is C and nothing else. And now we see that with complex phenomena, we can see that different types of answers are still not one is right and the other ones are all wrong, but that we kind of approximate the kind of right answer. Very often, as I said, we have stochastic functions that tell us it could be A, it could be B, C, but it will never be D. And to explain that is not that easy anymore. And I said, one of the easy way out is to say, well, if the scientists don't get their act together, and if they don't know, then, I take whatever I like. And then we get all this kind of populist movement in which people say, well, if things happen like you like it to happen, then there are very, dark, bad people in the background, below the earth or somewhere, and they make it not work. Because in reality, if we were in power, all of these things would become true. And then, of course, if they are in power, nothing of that comes true. And we know that, and that, of course, makes it even worse. Nevertheless, I think in order to get orientation in this kind of complex science where it's not enough to have, Wikipedia out there. I think what we do need are brokers that tell us, okay, well, and in my kind of categorization is to say, there are things that are certain. I mean, it's the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, it's pretty sure that's true, even in the whole universe. There are other things that are very likely to be true, but there are some, uncertainties, either on the factual side or on the interpretive side. There are things that are possible, but they're very unlikely. And I said vaccines, they will probably work, and they will work with most people, but not with all of them. And there are things that are absolutely absurd. And whatever we know today, they can't be true. Perpetuum mobile is an example for that. And so in that sense, there are, and scientists and can do this in a consensual way. We can put Delphi or what kind of processes to make sure that we make that distinction clearly. And then we need good communicators that come up and say, look, guys, what QAnon is telling you is absurd. And there is absolutely a consensus among all the scientists in the world that that is not true. And there's other things, where we say, yes, there's a possibility there, but it's very unlikely. And I think it would help us to bring things to some kind of, I would say, structure. And to get trust in this kind of system, it has to be something like a foundation, something that is not, dependent by any kind of interest group. That doesn't mean it's value free. It's still, people have values, and also people who are brokers have values, but they're not dependent on specific, interests or parties, and it should be plural. So many different plural groups should be represented there. And the idea is you get links for anything for that, what is absolutely truthful, where we're pretty sure that that's true, and what is absurd. So you can, and you get maybe documents for all of these things so that you can look it up yourself, but you need somebody who prepares this for you and somebody who's also well in communicating, because who communicates these sophisticated things is not an easy task. So that is basically my advice, to have something like this on the internet or also outside of the internet, also in educational systems, to bring people to better discern between the absurd and the real. I think those are also things that I would like to have covered with such an institution.
Okay, I would like to Sheila Jasanoff and Daniel Agacinski to join us now for the Q&A session. You can keep on asking your questions by email. Just send them to an email address, which is Anses Symposium 2021 questions at anses.fr, but it's very easy for you just to click on this very address, which you can find in the email that you received, in which all the connection data was in. So there are so many subjects that we would like to address with you. Now there was a question that really seemed important to me, which is, okay, now you can say that science is really challenged by conspiracy theories, fake news, and now everybody can feel that they are an expert because they come with some ideas, some facts, whether they are alternative facts or not, and make some reasonings and come with some results and just release them over the internet worldwide and just say their results with a lot of confidence. And that seems enough to create some kind of an expert, someone who will gain authority, someone who will have influence on others. So would you say that this type of system creates some kind of a crisis? Is expertise in crisis because of that and for other reasons as well? Mrs. Jasanoff, for instance, would you like to answer such a question?
No, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. It's a little difficult when there's two languages going on, as Ortwin has already mentioned, but it's better now. Is expertise in crisis? Well, I mean, to some extent, we call something a crisis and then it becomes a crisis. So there is a sort of responsibility on all our parts to be a little more analytic about what it is that we're talking about. Needless to say, the point you made that the world is awash in information through many channels in a way that it did not used to be, back 40 or 50 years ago. So that is a genuine change. But we should remember that we've always had these problems of who we trust and whom we authorize. And there are commonsensical things that I think science built on, and we have built our own understandings of credibility upon as well. One is that 4 eyes are better than 2. This is often said, and it's not just wearing glasses that makes you 4-eyed, but peer review is nothing more than an understanding that something seen from multiple standpoints is better than something seen from only one standpoint. We tend to believe in training. I mean, when people go to look for a doctor, they listen to their family members and they listen to their friends about who they've had good experiences with, but they also look at where the person was professionally trained and so forth. So I think it's a matter of noticing two things. One, that the tools with which we go about assessing anybody's credibility are somewhat the same for judging experts as they are for judging anybody else. Why do we trust the weather person who announces that there's going to be rain the next day? Why do I trust this symposium to have picked an anchor person that I should take seriously, and not because of personal knowledge, but because the mediating channels are ones into which we've put a certain amount of confidence. So the reasons we trust science and the reasons we trust everything else are not so different from one another. And multiple perspectives are better than a single one. So those are ways in which one can begin to work one's way around the so-called crisis. I don't think it's the case that any person can go and grab a megaphone and stand, on Hyde Park Corner and say something and the world will believe. It's a more complicated translation phenomenon than that.
Mr. Renn, is expertise in crisis?
Sorry, was that a follow-up?
Mr. Renn, did you hear me? My question was, is expertise in crisis in your view?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes, now.
My question was, is expertise in crisis?
Oh, this was a question to me?
Yes.
Okay, sure. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult here in terms of technology, specifically with the various voices that come up here. So expertise in crisis, I think what's I think it's important. I think that Sheila just made that point very clearly. I mean, there's not just scientists who are asked for. There are people, emergency helpers. There's a health system that is very important, the fire engine, whatever. I mean, there's a whole set of institutional helpers that are part of the crisis team. And I think credibility in a crisis is first functionality. I think as with people have an experience that it functions in the past, then they also may have, or very often have, then the feeling that it will also help in the future. Now, if you have a crisis like this one, which seems to be unprecedented, at least for many, many decades in terms of pandemics, then there is more distrust in the sense, well, we haven't experienced anything like this before, and we feel that maybe the various institutions are not apt to the job. And then again, there are, you know, some things that could done, you know, on the basis of plausibility, but if things are getting fairly complex, then it's sometimes difficult to just rely on intuition. And then either you have other forms of aligning credibility to institutions like, you know, whatever, that they have a good formal education, or that they embody people that you feel are trustworthy. I mean, there are kind of secondary cues that are very often important. But as you could see also in this crisis, there are quite a few, I mean, almost 10 to 15% who have no trust in the system, and even believe in very strange conspiracy theories. And I think we need to know what drives them away from, let's say, any reasonable explanation of what's happening. And that, I think, is still an open question.
Mr. Agacinski, maybe the same question to you.
The question you raise is about the circulation of information, is who listens to whom and who believes whom. And I don't think that even with the social media, with the internet, you have a person who comes in front of everybody and saying, I'm an expert and I can tell you what the truth is about this subject. The process is much more complex than it is. You said it, people who helped the climate skepticism to develop were high-level scientists, and people who made false claim about medicines, about COVID-19, were high-level scientists. And the media, the mass media, still remain much more frequently read and listened to than the individuals on the social media. So there's no such thing as a flat world of information. Hierarchies remain in the information, but they are not the same as they were before. The great networks, the great media, are not the same as they were a few years before. So that's the reason why we are a little lost in this world of information. And more specifically, the point made by Mr. Renn about systemic risks engage a much more difficult path for expertise to help public decision, because you cannot do the same as the state did a few dozens of years ago. When you have a problem, you have a kind of scientists, of engineers, of people from the statistics, and you can trust one profession about one subject. It's much more complicated than it was before, and that leads also to some kind of crisis of expertise.
So, Mr. Agacinski, again, we often talk, that's a question which is sent by one of our viewers. We often talk about mistrust from the public towards experts. What about mistrust from scientists towards the general public?
You have also mistrust from the ruling elite, the governments, to the citizens. There's a revert mistrust that's been studied from some people in France, the Pacte Civique, studying the way that administrations and governments develop and express mistrust towards citizens. And that's the case from the scientists too, because you often hear scientists saying we must do some pedagogy, I don't know it's the good word in English, which is literally taking the general public for children, and which is, I think, a wrong way to rebuild trust, because it supposes that the people that don't agree with your point of view don't know what they're talking about. If it's a very technical and scientific question, you can have scientific mediation, scientific explanation, but if, when it comes to the link between science and politics, people are not children, and you cannot make pedagogy, or you create anger in the general public if you do so.
We have other questions over the internet. One of them, maybe, can you answer it? Mrs. Jasanoff, what does the current COVID crisis tell us, confirms or contradicts about the legitimacy and the efficiency of democracy for risk management?
Sorry, again, there's so much interference from the two languages. Are you asking what can the COVID crisis tell us about democracy?
Yes, about the legitimacy.
Could you possibly repeat the question?
Exactly, you're right. What does the current COVID crisis tell us about the legitimacy and efficiency of democracy for risk management?
Okay, thank you for risk management. So one of the things that I think we have to agree on is that it makes a problem out of the word democracy itself. I mean, this is something that I was thinking about when I was listening to my friend Ortwin talking before, because one of the pronouns that showed up a lot of times in his discussion of systemic risk was we, the first person plural, and I kept wondering who the we is, because part of the problem with a pandemic, with a global crisis, is the very definition of who the collective is for whom a truth statement has any value whatsoever. So this morning, one of the news items in my mailbox is that in China, a conspiracy theory has been growing that the coronavirus was actually a product of a US Army lab. Now, many of you are familiar with the fact that there is a belief in many places that the coronavirus was a product of a Chinese lab. So in English, this is called a tit for tat position, that one group believes one thing and the other counters with a different thing. And there's a kind of ping pong game of conspiracy charges being leveled on all sides. So there clearly isn't a single global we from whose point of view the word democracy can be judged. I think, based on the kind of work that my colleagues and I do, that part of the challenge going forward for expertise is to recognize that there can't be credible expertise until we rebuild some sense of who the community is for whom the expertise matters and for whom the expertise has validity. When we're confronting a global challenge, there is no such thing as a global demos. In that sense, I do think it poses a challenge to an idea of democracy, because frankly, we've allowed science and technology to become global without allowing our governance systems to become correspondingly global. This is why my sort of incremental constitutionalism idea, I think, does need to be taken seriously by us all in some sense. We need to rebuild the democracy, the demos, for whom a word like democracy will have some meaning in a greatly interconnected and speeded up world.
So that's one of the reasons why you advocate for global places where there could be a debate and over some subjects, such as gene editing. You advocate for a global observatory for genome editing, for instance. Mr. Daniel Agacinski, what do you think of this idea of creating such debate forums throughout the world about various subjects, scientific and technological subjects?
The point made by Sheila is very important, because it's the misfit between the scientific area, the scientific debate, and the political, on the collective we that we have to deal with. And I guess that one of the global forum about this is a great example, the IPCC.
Yes, exactly.
The IPCC.
I was thinking about that, but I was thinking about the IPCC, except that the IPCC is only well, the only stakeholders are scientists.
No,
really,
governments too.
Okay,
Governments
okay, they're part of it.
Okay, that's a very important point, because it's not the scientist republic. It's the relationship between governments and scientists that are built inside this quite new, well, not new right now, but it's quite original construction. And of course, it's not a solution that's sufficient to eliminate climate skepticism, but it made wonderful progresses in a lot of countries thanks to this kind of organization. And that's an example that can be looked at to be made again in other fields of science and technology.
Ortwin, Renn, what do you make of this suggestion made by Mrs. Jasanoff of maybe creating such global forums in which some types of scientific and technological issues will be addressed with various stakeholders, not only scientists?
Yeah. Well, I think what Sheila just made a very good point of saying, who is we? And I think that's a really important element to see that there's not one solution for everyone. I think in terms of the crisis, we can see that the viruses, have no differentiation between one human being or the other. But the conditions under which humans live make a difference whether you're more susceptible to become sick or not. So in that sense, it's very important to make a very clear distinction, what I call the risk-absorbing system. What are we talking about? Is this just all of humans? Is it just a nation? Is it only privileged people or people that are living under very severe constraints? And then, of course, the reality is a different one also in a pandemic. So we can see the pandemic is not a big equalizer as some of us had, predicted in the first place. Mm. So creating a global stations in which, global issues are being addressed always needs to think about, yes, there are global problems, but they're all different regional manifestations. So in terms of space, but also different social manifestations in terms of what the context conditions are under which these people live. That does not mean that everything is relative. And I think I want to make that point very clearly. We can still make sure in what kind of context what things work. And then we can also very often scale up experiences from case studies to a larger context. So I'm all for it that we take that kind of global stations as a serious approach, but it must be very clear that we need to have regional answers for global problems. And if we can derive at those and not to have a global answer for all global problems, then I think we'll be in trouble. And it's also not very valid, and it will definitely not be equitable. So if we see that there are global challenges that we, as all humans, face, global climate change is one, but we are differently affected and we are differently contributing to this. And so this needs to be taken into account when we talk about solutions. And that, I think it's very clear, is yes, we have to think globally, not only act regionally, but we also have to see the problem regionally, frame it within the regional or social frame in which you operate, and then lead it back to the kind of global challenge and to see how much it can contribute to resolving the global problem in total.
Yes, so we have a question that's very related to what you just said. Here it is. Systemic risks are global, or some of them are global. How could we coordinate the different governance scales for systemic risk management?
Yeah, well, I think it fits very well with your previous question. I think what we see is that these risks are interconnected, and they're interconnected in terms of they cross over from one domain to another. So we have different ministries, different agencies responsible. And at the same time, they're very often transboundary. They go from one country to the other. And that makes it sometimes very difficult to calculate first, the magnitude of these risks, because there are different constituencies that are responsible for these kinds of assessments. And secondly, its governance is even more problematic if it's transboundary, if it crosses the various sections of responsibility and accountability. And that's where I think what we do need is new institutional mechanisms that are kind of get this integrative approach. And we cannot integrate everything with everything, but what we can do is to say, okay, or look at these various risk agents that are pointed out and to see which agencies need to be brought together in order to come up with a cascading risk that has impacts on different domains, and how can we make sure that we are not regulating one on the expense of the other? And that happens quite often. And I think, yes, so we need an approach in which, we do kind of a cross-integration, but then in terms of problems that we would like to address, because otherwise, it gets, not manageable anymore. So I was always advocating, for example, for national risk assessments with a risk board. So national risk assessment tells us, what are the main priority risks that we will face and have to face when we look into different domains at the same time. And that can help also to first identify those, but secondly also to have in advance some of the management mechanisms ready when some of these kind of systemic interacting risks actually occur.
And in fact, there's a question which is at the root of our symposium and which is absolutely fundamental. And I've been really, I really wanted to ask it. Maybe to Mrs. Jasanoff and Mr. Agacinski, who is a philosopher. To what extent is truth just a construction? You have 3 minutes.
To what extent is what just a construction?
Yes, to what extent is truth just a construction?
Thank you. The word truth is spoken in many, many contexts. For instance, religions have an idea of what the truth is, and one has a sense of what in social life truth means. Is somebody being true to himself or herself is a question you can ask, and it has meaning. So I think maybe you're asking to what extent is scientific truth a construction, because truth by and large is such a broad word that it is clearly a construction in all sorts of ways. And I think any practicing scientist who has some experience of finding facts will tell you, yes, it is always a construction, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have robustness. That doesn't mean that you can't compare one claim of truth against another. In science and technology studies, people often use the term truth claim. That is something that you assert is a truth. Being humble and provisional about its origins, about its foundations, recognizing that the very assumptions on which you built that claim could change. You could discover something new about the world. You could discover that maybe this isn't the right way to divide up the world and you should be talking about something else. So, I think that, yes, I would say it is always a construction, and I'm not alone in this understanding, but I would also be with people who say that when you cut into the world at any given point, there are things that we can accept as being more truthful or more worthy of respect as foundations to build upon than other things. But one must always ask what the basis for those kinds of comparative claims is, and not just let it go as an assertion that doesn't deserve to be questioned.
Mr. Agacinski, about this subject of truth.
Yeah, the question I would like to ask you is, what does it mean that it is a construction? And what a difference it makes saying that it is a construction? And the answer I would like to give is that...
Is it just a construction, or does it
have
you
change the
question with reality?
You change the question. And I mean, if it is a construction, I guess it means that you are able to know how it's made, how it is made, and to understand the way it's been built. And that is what we can expect from scientific truth. And that's a very important point, because the basis for scientific truth is the way you manage to come to a conclusion. You can do it again and again and again in several places, in several times, and it doesn't matter the person who gets the conclusion. And yes, it's been built, it's a construction, and you can understand the way and the limits of the truth to which you come to. And that's the first meaning we can give to this session.
Perfect. And we have another question for you, Mr. Agacinski. Don't you think that the frequently observed inability to grasp the complexities and uncertainties by the media, including the more serious ones, or by politicians in this society of speed, is an important element of mistrust in expertise and experts? So the fact that media and the politicians are unable to grasp the complexities and uncertainties in science, for instance.
Certainly, but we have to be careful with that kind of conclusion, because you can say it's the media are not good enough at science to understand it, and the politics are not well enough trained in science to understand. And that's the reason why we need brokers, as said Mr. Renn. But the brokers themselves, whether they are journalists or science brokers, they have power. In the marketplace, brokers have power. In the marketplace of information, of scientific information, they would have power too. And as soon as you come to power, you can get mistrust and all these kinds of difficulties. So I like the way Mr. Renn put it, and it's about addressing and not resolving this issue.
Addressing and not pretending that you can resolve this type of issue. Mr. Renn, you asked a very interesting question in the abstract you wrote to introduce your speech, and you asked how much can you democratize scientific expertise without losing the rigor of creating robust knowledge. So you're advocating, you and Mr. Agacinski, towards a more open type of debate with lay knowledge, for instance. Can that be a problem with regards to the rigor of scientific expertise, for instance?
Yeah, sure. I think the key word here is knowledge. And I think scientific knowledge is only one part of different types of knowledge. And it's not so that scientific knowledge is always superior to what kind of activities you want to do. If you want to, tie a shoelace, scientific knowledge doesn't help me much, and I have to experience it and have to try it several times before I really know how to do it. So if knowledge is really also meant to have any kind of impact on activities, on action, on decision making, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of knowledge do we need in order to make a good and prudent decision? And very often scientific knowledge helps us to say, what do we know about causes and effects? So if I do X, what can happen? And do we have enough previous experience that we can really count on, either statistically or through experiments, that can tell us if you do X, is it going to happen, even if you expect something different to happen? And that is where science is very good at, because very often it's counterintuitive. But very often we don't have that kind of systematic knowledge, or it's being taken from a different context, so we cannot really also apply it to the situation in which you are in. Very often it's not just one problem, but a whole set of problems that are being being addressed at the same time. So, you need a lot of interdisciplinary knowledge that help you to really acknowledge the kind of consequences. And very often it's the contextual constraints are so unique that only good experience can help you to answer your question. So in a sense, when we're trying to resolve problems, it is very important to say, well, what kind of knowledge do we need, and what can each type of knowledge contribute to resolving the issue or to come up with a good decision? Mm-hmm. And very often scientific knowledge does help. And it's not a good idea then to replace scientific knowledge with intuition, because intuition can fail you very often. But if scientific knowledge is not there, or as Sheila just said, is not very robust, if there are a lot of competing science truth claims that you do not know which one is true, very often you know what's absurd. I think that's something that I think very often we do know. And then we can enrich it with, either tested knowledge from the people that have some kind of exposure to it. Sometimes it's a kind of indigenous knowledge that has been created over many, many years. And again, we have to see the context, whether it really applies or not. And bringing this together is very often a good recipe to think about, kind of complex issues. And science is a major player, and it cannot be replaced, but it's not the only one.
Mm-hmm. Not the only player. Okay. I would like to ask you the same question, Sheila Jasanoff. How much can you democratize scientific expertise without losing the rigor of creating robust knowledge?
So again, are you asking how much one can replace the rigor of science with?
How much can you democratize? The question is about democratizing scientific expertise, having it open to lay knowledge, for instance.
Yeah. Well, if you look at successful attempts to generate knowledge on large scales, so the IPCC was mentioned before, for instance, you will find that there's been progressively more incorporation of other perspectives and points of view. I mean, even the idea of an intergovernmental panel on climate change is itself a bow to the idea of democratization, because it's not saying, just the people who are the best climate modelers in the world belong here, but people who come from different cultures of understanding and generating evidence, that they should all get together in some sense. And again, if you look at the IPCC reports over the years, you find that there's been a gradual widening of horizons to bring in more perspectives. So this is not just one scholar or another asserting something about what makes for robustness. I think it is a consequence of the ways in which we understand public knowledge production, knowledge about things that affect the public, that robustness requires a degree of inclusion. Now, that, I think, just moves the debate to a different place. So it shouldn't be about whether wider circles should be included or not. I think that has been amply shown over and over, that why it's necessary, and Ortwin has just mentioned some of those ideas. The question is, under what sort of rules of the game? That is, when should we open the doors wider, to whom? These are all procedural questions that need visiting. It's worth pointing out that most countries already have some rules in place, but those are not necessarily adequate, and that they need to be revisited even more when we're talking about worldwide global problems that are bumping up against very different cultural understandings of what a risk is and who should be making the decisions. So I think that the key thing now is to move towards a deeper and more political understanding of the ways in which we generate expertise, and then moving on to a domain of cosmopolitanism, where we begin to understand other people's politics of expertise better than we have understood even our own to this date. That is a tall order, to be reflexive and cosmopolitan at the same time.
We have a question for Mr. Agacinski about the media, and here it is. The media's emphasis on contradiction, on confrontation, seems to impact the media, public opinion, decision-making whole chain. Between freedom of the press and the attractiveness of scandalous articles, is there still a place to limit this tendency for sometimes useless confrontation? There's always this question of how can you, could there be some kind of a police somewhere, some army which will be able to stop things from going aloof?
Yes, even if I thought that it was a good thing to have a government police of the media, there are so many media now that it would not even be possible. And I guess it's a good thing that it's not possible, because of course you have freedom of the press, you have freedom of the debate, and you have this temptation for the media to have a very intensive fight or debate, and this is inevitable when you consider that those scientific issues are linked with political issues. And if you pretend that your policy or your politics is based on science, then don't be astonished if your opponents say that science is a matter of politics. And that's the reason why when you come to the media that usually deal with political issues, and you have the same form of debate when it comes to scientific issues. And that's the reason why you have that kind of polarization of the debate, even of scientific issues, when they come to the front page of the news that impact the political facts of the day. Mm.
So I want to thank you very much, Sheila, Jasanoff, Ortwin, Renn, Mr. Agacinski. This was only the beginning of this symposium titled Credibility of Scientific Expertise and Decision Making. Tomorrow we will have another session, another full session dedicated to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will have the pleasure to meet with Stephen Hillgartner from Cornell University, who has made an international comparison with Sheila Jasanoff, I must say, regarding the way various countries in the world reacted to the COVID pandemic. We will have Catherine Bourguin here as well. She's from INSERM, and she will discuss modeling in the age of COVID-19. And Daniel Agacinski as well, who is from CNRS, and he is involved in the scientific committee which advises the French government at the moment regarding the corona crisis. It will be at 3 p.m. Paris time, that's CET, Central European Time. Be there. Thanks again, Sheila, Ortwin, Daniel, thanks very much. We really appreciate you sharing your perspectives. And don't forget that you also can attend workshops that will take place in January and February. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.